Every major warrior culture across human history arrived at the exact same answers, independently, separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years. That's not a coincidence, and it's not mythology. This video is about what Spartan boys, Roman legionnaires, Japanese samurai, and Norse warriors actually did to build themselves into something the world hadn't seen before, and why modern neuroscience, exercise physiology, and clinical psychology are now confirming that those ancient methods were precisely correct. Stick around to the end, because the through line across all of these traditions is stranger and more practical than you'd expect. And you'll see how much of this you can actually use starting today. At age 7, Spartan boys were taken from their families, and what came next wasn't primarily physical training. What followed was not a fitness program. Yes, there were long marches and combat drills. But the core of the Agoge was psychological. Boys were deliberately exposed to cold, hunger, discomfort, and hardship, not as punishment, but as curriculum. The goal was to build something specific, the ability to remain functional when conditions were terrible. Modern psychology has a clinical term for this. It's called distress tolerance, and it's currently a foundational pillar of dialectical behavior therapy, one of the most evidence-backed therapeutic frameworks in existence. DBT uses deliberate, controlled exposure to discomfort to train the nervous system to stay regulated under stress. The Spartans were running this protocol 2,500 years ago without the clinical language to describe what they were doing or why. They didn't need the language. They had something better, a feedback loop with lethal stakes running for centuries. The training methods that produced better warriors survived. The ones that didn't were abandoned. What remained after all those cycles of selection was a system that worked, and it worked for neurological reasons that nobody would articulate until the 21st century. The Agoge also included what modern coaches now call voluntary hardship training, deliberate exposure to conditions worse than what you'll face in competition, so that competition itself feels manageable by comparison. Spartan boys were intentionally underfed, not to weaken them, but to develop resourcefulness and decision-making under physical stress. Every element served a function, nothing was suffering for its own sake. Did the Roman army build an entire road network around how the human body actually moves? Roman legionnaires marched 20 miles per day carrying roughly 60 pounds of kit, not in training, but on campaign, in full load, full pace, regardless of weather or terrain. Modern exercise scientists have a name for what that produces: load carriage conditioning. It's a set of neural and muscular adaptations that develop only through sustained heavy carries over time. You cannot replicate it in a gym. You have to carry weight over distance, repeatedly, until your body rebuilds itself around the demand. What's striking is what the Romans built around this. The Via Militaris, the Roman military road system, was constructed to exact specifications that match the optimal legionnaire march stride. The road grade, the surface, the width, all calibrated to the biomechanics of a loaded human body moving at sustained pace. That is not ancient guesswork. That is applied physiology, derived from thousands of miles of real-world data and then encoded into infrastructure. The Roman army lasted roughly 1,000 years as a fighting force. The training system that produced it was not mystical, it was methodical, and the physical adaptations it built, the tendon strength, the joint resilience, the sustained aerobic capacity, are the same adaptations modern sports science recommends for high-performance endurance athletes today. Why would the deadliest swordsman in history spend years learning poetry, calligraphy, and the tea ceremony? To an outside observer, it looks like contradiction: warriors who make art, killers who practice stillness. But the samurai weren't confused about what they were building. The Zen meditation, the tea ceremony, the calligraphy, all of it was emotional regulation training. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for attention, impulse control, and decision-making under pressure, strengthens measurably through sustained meditation practice. Brain imaging confirms this. The cortex associated with self-regulation is physically thicker in long-term meditators. A samurai who panicked in combat was a dead samurai. Emotional regulation wasn't a soft skill, it was a survival requirement. The most accomplished sword schools taught a concept called mushin, a state of mind with no fixed attachment, no grasping at outcomes, fully present in the moment of engagement. Miyamoto Musashi, the most celebrated swordsman in Japanese history, wrote in the Book of Five Rings that the ultimate goal of sword training was not technique but perception, seeing clearly, without fear or anticipation distorting what was in front of you. The tea ceremony built exactly this: precise, unhurried attention in a space stripped of distraction. A samurai who could pour tea with absolute steadiness could draw a blade with absolute steadiness. The practices weren't separate, they were the same practice in different clothes. Norse warriors used a technique called berserking, and the popular image of pure rage misses the actual method. The real practice involved deliberate breathing rituals and psychological preparation before entering combat. Modern research on controlled hyperventilation shows real neurochemical effects: an adrenaline spike, reduced pain perception, elevated stress tolerance. The Vikings weren't just working themselves into a frenzy. They were triggering a specific physiological state, intentionally and repeatedly. And every single one of these warrior cultures used cold exposure. Cold water immersion for recovery, ritual, and hardening. Spartans in cold streams, Japanese warriors in waterfall meditation, Norse warriors in winter conditions year-round. Regular cold exposure lowers inflammatory markers, triggers norepinephrine release that improves mood and focus, and trains the nervous system to stay calm under acute physical stress. These cultures found it through observation. Modern science confirmed every piece of it. Here's what's impossible to dismiss, and what these convergent traditions actually tell you: these cultures didn't communicate. Sparta and feudal Japan were separated by roughly 1,500 years and half a planet. The Roman legions and the Norse warriors operated in entirely different worlds, and yet they converged on the same core methods: distress tolerance through deliberate hardship, load-bearing movement, breath control, emotional regulation through practiced stillness, and cold exposure. When independent systems arrive at the same answer without any contact with each other, that answer is almost always true. These weren't superstitions or cultural traditions preserved out of sentiment. They were empirical protocols refined over centuries of real-world testing. The practical implication is straightforward. You don't need an ancient warrior tradition to validate cold exposure, breathwork, or load-bearing movement. The science validates them independently. If this kind of deep dive into warrior traditions and performance science is your thing, subscribe so you don't miss the next one.